As the sun rose on the 6th of July, 1685, the battlefield of Sedgemoor, these very fields, were soaked in blood. The courageous and loyal rebel army of the Duke of Monmouth was either dead, dying, captured, or on the run. His enemy, the red-coated royalist army of his uncle, King James II, stood victorious. They had held their ground in the murderous firefight at night, and as morning came, they surrounded their enemy and crushed them. The Duke of Monmouth, having seen that all had failed, had fled the battlefield. But how had it come to this? How had a royal duke invaded England, gathered an army of thousands of loyal supporters, to end in this tiny corner of Somerset? Why had men left the safety and security of their homes and jobs to follow a man they had never met before? Let's find out. This is a very personal series for me. Firstly, it was being taught the Monmouth Rebellion that really sparked my interest in history. Secondly, as you can probably tell, I reenact the Monmouth Rebellion with my reenactment group, the Taunton Garrison. And thirdly, the story of the Monmouth Rebellion is a cracking story. It's got heroes and villains, it's got conspiracy and treachery, it's got bloodshed and battle, and it ends with Judge Jeffreys and the bloody assizes. For a schoolboy, what's not to love? So the life of James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, what are we going to cover? Well, his whole life. From his birth in Holland to Charles II and Lucy Walter, to his life in Restoration England under King Charles II. He'll become the Captain General of the English Army, gain fame at the Siege of Maastricht under Louis XIV. But during the 1670s and 1680s, he becomes embroiled in the politics and scandal of Restoration England. Forced into exile, he then hears the news of the death of his father, King Charles II. He forms a rebellion in the southwest of England and marches up to here, the battlefield of Sedgemoor, where he loses in 1685. His end will be a grisly one, but that tale will be for another time. During this series, we're going to be looking at the uniforms, the armies, the weapons of the men who fought. We're going to be looking at the barber surgeon of the time. We're going to be looking at the politics and the religion and the characters of that period. It's going to be a fantastic series, and I hope you join me for it. For King Charles I, the fortunes of war had finally turned against him. His northern armies had been torn apart at Marston Moor in 1644. The Scots were in the field against him, and Parliament had taken the decisive step in creating the new model army. His armies were struggling with supplies, morale and fighting ability, but he also had other worries away from the battlefield. Charles had already been forced to send his wife, Queen Henrietta Maria, out of the country for safety, and now he feared that his eldest son, the Prince of Wales, the future Charles II, would be captured. In 1645, the year of the decisive victory for Parliament at Naseby, the young Charles, a mere 15 years old, was nominally in charge of royalist forces in the west of England. The king decided that his eldest son must be sent into exile for his own safety. After a painful decision, Charles gave a tearful farewell to his son in 1646, who proceeded to France and to safety. This boy, already tall, dark, and with devilish good looks, would never see his father again. With his embattled father disappearing into view, Charles travelled to Paris to meet his mother, Henrietta Maria. This boy with black hair, tall and athletic, would need all his charm and resolve in the years ahead. Yet Charles was not content to bide his time in France and await developments. He wanted action and to help his father, the king. He promptly moved to Holland, where he began preparing an invasion of England, with the help of the parliamentary navy, which had fortunately just mutinied. As he planned and built up forces and arms with what little money he had, he realised for the first time that he was free from regal supervision and was experiencing real liberation. It was at this moment, enjoying this newfound freedom, that he met one Lucy Walter, the future mother of his son, James Scott, later to become the Duke of Monmouth. For Charles it was just to be a one-night stand, a moment of unbridled passion soon to be forgot. But for one thing, Lucy had become pregnant. So who was Lucy Walter, and why was she in Holland? Lucy and her family were respectable gentry from Pembrokeshire. The family owned Roche Castle, as well as substantial lands about. The castle was described as a very considerable place, with over 500 head of oxen and 2,000 sheep. She was the same age as Charles, and very beautiful. Lucy's father was by all accounts an abusive brute. He was an adulterer, a bully, and even had an affair with one of the family's maids. He was so abusive that a court order demanded that the children must be handed over to Lucy's mother, and that he was to have no more dealings with them. Maybe due to a lack of evidence, or because of his aggressive manner, the court's decision was overturned, and the children were ordered to return to their father for their keeping and education. Elizabeth, Lucy's mother, was not going to accept that decision, and took Lucy, and they both fled to Holland. As the women fled, it must have been in Lucy's mind that there was no certainty in their lives, no stability, and was there going to be a tomorrow? Why not live for the moment, enjoy oneself, meet people, and just have fun? It was perhaps prudent they did escape husband and father, as very soon Roche Castle was burned down by the Royalists. Straight after Lucy had landed in the Netherlands, she gained a reputation for being bewitchingly beautiful, with her dark hair, pale skin, and full red lips. Although far from home and lacking money, she still longed for jewellery, fashionable clothes, and expensive belongings. The need for the nicer things in life meant she would need a wealthy suitor, and she soon started looking. There is little proof, but plenty of rumour, that Lucy did find a way to make money whilst in exile. It is suggested she became a prostitute and was purchased by Colonel Algernon Sidney for 50 pieces of gold. This relationship, be it true or not, was not to last, for Sidney's regiment was soon mobilised and Sidney had to move away. Sidney would not disappear in our story, however, for 35 years later he would reappear at Lucy's son's side, and the talk would be of invasion and treason. Lucy was clearly having to live by her wits, with the Netherlands full of exiles, desperate men, as well as parliamentary and royalist spies. She was so careful that she would travel under the pseudonym of Barlow. She may have used this name as there was a belief that she was actually a royalist spy. Yet as soon as Sidney had marched off with his men, another Sidney would come into her life, his brother, Colonel Robert Sidney. But once again, this was not to last. For now, described as of no good fame but handsome, Charles, hearing of her, found means to get her from his colonel, and Lucy herself was not averse to so advantageous change. She soon bedded the Prince of Wales of Britain, and for Lucy it must have seemed all her dreams were coming true. But for her newfound lover, life in exile was getting bleaker. Terrible news followed bad. A failed invasion attempt by Charles was followed by the news of the devastating royalist defeat at Preston, where out of an army of 10,000, 2,000 had been killed. This decisive blow to the failing royalist cause was followed in a few months by the unthinkable news that his father, Charles I, was dead, beheaded by the English Rump Parliament. It is worth pausing here for a moment and try and put ourselves in the young Prince Charles's shoes. This was a young man who had seen his life, his country, and family torn apart by war. A man forced to leave his country. A man who had just heard his father had been executed. A young man who was about to become a father. A man who had now had the crushing responsibility of being the figurehead of the royalist cause. It must have been overwhelming for the young man. He was not present when Lucy gave birth to their young boy, although men wouldn't have been at the birth anyway, but he was nearby. Soon after the birth, however, he was in Paris trying to lever support and funds to regain the concept of monarchy for Britain. But even in France, who were shocked for King Charles's execution, universal support for the young prince was not forthcoming. Louis XIV had not officially condemned the execution, and the nobility of Saint-Germain were uncertain as to how they should welcome and greet the young prince. Despite Charles's problems, As soon as Lucy and baby James were able, they caught up with Charles. She travelled with the scholar John Evelyn, who coined the famous description of Lucy, bold and insipid, lovely to behold. Evelyn would go on and write that Charles was actually much taken with Lucy. He wrote, "Her beauty was so perfect that when the king saw her, he was so charmed, ravished, and enamoured. He knew he was so charmed, he knew no other sweetness or joy than to love her and be loved by her." By this time, Charles had returned to Breda in the Netherlands to discuss matters with the Scots. The talk of bringing Charles to Scotland, crown him king there, and invade England. In Breda, Charles invited Lucy to bring James and present him to the Scottish diplomats, perhaps to give proof of his virility. With the niceties out of the way, and leaving mother and child behind, Charles sailed for Scotland to begin his own invasion. It was perhaps inevitable that this was to prove unsuccessful. The Scots crowned him in 1650 at Scone, after he had already agreed to the Presbyterian demands and signed the national covenant. It must have seemed that Charles had his fingers crossed when making these promises. The idea of the covenant would come back to haunt Charles years later, but would also make his son, the future Duke of Monmouth, a real hero. The campaign would eventually meet with disaster at Dunbar in 1650, when Oliver Cromwell's new model army crushed the Scottish forces. After this defeat, the Scots, with Charles, moved south into England, looking to reignite the royalist cause. But this support did not materialise, and Charles's hopes finally ended at Worcester in 1651. After Worcester, Charles fled for his life, hunted by vengeful parliamentarians, hiding in the now famous Royal Oak, and finally back to the Netherlands. But during this time away, word had reached the prince that Lucy Walter, the mother of his child, had returned to her old, loose moral ways. It seems that she had become an embarrassment to Charles in his absence. Charles was not slow in setting things in motion. On hearing the news, he was soon ordering the kidnap of his own son. The men chosen had to be true and trusty, and capable of carrying out this potentially tricky operation. They were Thomas Eliot, groom of the bedchamber, John Griffiths, and James Eliot. Their mission? To take the future Duke of Monmouth from his mother by any means. As the kidnap was being plotted, Lucy herself was in the Dutch port of Schieden, a mere 3 miles from Rotterdam. The young boy James was in the care of his wet nurse. The operation against the boy had been well planned and revolved around a certain Paul Watts, who had infiltrated and gained work in Lucy's household. Watts knew that Lucy could not turn down invitations from the wealthy and prominent citizens of the Netherlands, and so managed to get the Earl of Craven to accompany Lucy to the Rotterdam fair. As soon as the two were gone, the men pounced, and the son of Charles was taken. Lucy, on her return, reacted as you may expect a mother to react. She was horror-struck and became hysterical. It was noted she rent her apparel, tore the hair from off her head, and whole showers of tears bewailed the greatness of her loss. Despite the terror of her situation in losing her child and the potential influence Lucy could wield through the child, she marshalled her senses and acted. Calling for horses, she rode to the port of Maastricht because she thought, incorrectly as it turned out, that the abduction was ordered by the English Republic. She believed James and his kidnappers would be on board a ship bound for England. Arriving at the port, she confronted the mayor and ordered him to stop all outbound ships from leaving. The mayor, without any evidence in front of him, refused. But Lucy was not going to be fobbed off and threw gold coins at his feet and screamed as loud as she could that a royal child had been abducted. With an embarrassing scene being watched by a rapidly gathering crowd, the mayor submitted and closed the port to all ships leaving. Whether James and his kidnappers were on a ship is unknown, but 10 days later James was discovered and returned to his distraught mother. Now, whether the kidnappers were eventually tracked down because the abduction was causing too many dangers is unknown. But what had become apparent, though, was that Lucy was a force to be reckoned with, and was more than likely to cause even more trouble for Charles and his Stuart court in exile. The failed kidnap and Lucy's miraculous recovery of James soon reached the ear of Charles, as he arrived back in the Netherlands. But his life and his reputation had changed beyond all imagination, even though his invasion had proved a failure. He was now a king, now that he had been crowned in Scotland. The tales of his exploits and his escape were now the talk of the town, even shared by men such as the Doge of Venice and the Grand Duke of Tuscany. Now being a crowned monarch, his support from European kings slowly began to build. As Charles's fortunes were slowly improving, Lucy's were beginning to fade fast. As soon as she heard Charles was back, she tried to meet him, but by this time, Charles has had enough of Lucy. Her reputation had taken more blows, and her credit in Paris was at an all-time low. Things were getting so bad that English newspapers were taking delight when they heard the rumour that there had been attempts to poison Lucy. Turned down by Charles, she found solace in the arms of Theobald Viscount Taaffe, a socialite who drank, danced, and threw regular parties. A rogue and indifferent soldier, he was to have a child with Lucy, but did his best to persuade Charles to give Lucy a regular income to look after their son James. This regular payment may also have been seen as a bribe to stop Lucy making more embarrassing public displays, which could well bring the future Stuart monarch into disrepute. These payments were said to have been in the region of 5,000 livres per year. This may seem a huge amount, but Charles didn't have 500 livres to give, let alone 5,000. Charles also tried other attempts to keep Lucy out of his life. Agents of his travelled to Lucy and tried to reassure her that there would be no more kidnap attempts if she promised to move. Perhaps because she hasn't received any of the promised 5,000 livres, or perhaps she just didn't want to move, Lucy refused. She was struggling in her relationships and had even been accused of attempting a murder of a maid by stabbing a darning needle in her ear. The reason? The maid was about to spread rumours that her mistress was leading an immoral life and had 2 abortions. Eventually, her relationship with Taaffe had finally run its course, but she was soon to be seen with another companion. This time, a Thomas Howard, the younger brother of the Earl of Suffolk. Lucy seems to have been happy with her new love, especially as he held a prestigious position of Master of Horse to the Princess of Orange. Lucy apparently was finally happy, had her son James with her, and had moved in with Howard and away from Charles. For Lucy and Charles, it seems that things were slowly calming down. But Lucy's luck was not to last long at any time. Whilst enjoying her new life, she received the devastating news that her mother, Elizabeth, had died, and that her estates and her will needed sorting immediately. The only trouble was that this would mean travelling to England. England the Republic. England led by the chief enemy of the Stuarts, Oliver Cromwell. And she was to travel with her son James, the son of the figurehead of the exiled Stuart court. It was literally walking into the lion's den. But seemingly unworried by the potential danger she was placing herself and precious son in, this small group sailed for England. When she arrived, she didn't keep herself out of the authorities' line of sight. She travelled to London and holed up above a barber shop near Somerset House. She may have believed she was incognito and had slipped into Cromwell's military state without anyone noticing, but they had. Being believed to be a royalist spy, she and James were arrested and taken to the Tower of London. We can only imagine the sheer terror of both mother and child as they were hustled and prodded into the dark, forbidding corridors of that infamous fortress. Little did James know that 30 years later he would once again be dragged into the tower, but this time with the shadow of the axe over his head. Lucy was clearly seen as a genuine threat, as she was soon interrogated, and by none other than by the tower's commander, John Barkstead. He was ruthless and unrelenting in his questioning. His questioning was brutal, and it took all of Lucy's courage and guile to maintain the illusion she was an innocent inhabitant of London. Barkstead made a breakthrough though when he interrogated Lucy's maid, Anne Hill, who had only been with her mistress for 7 months. With no real loyalty to Lucy, she told all about Lucy, her relationship with Charles, and who the young boy was. It would appear that Cromwell's police state had captured a huge prize, a royalist spy, along with the son of the enemy of the Cromwellian state. But what were they to do with them? Execute them? Imprison them? To Lucy's relief and surprise, they were soon released and ordered to return to the Netherlands. But why? Perhaps Cromwell believed that Lucy and her erratic and embarrassing behaviour was actually advantageous to Cromwell and England. So release her and let her cause havoc and confusion to the Stuart exiles. And this is what she did, almost immediately. Arriving back in the Netherlands, her relationship with Howard had got to its lowest point, ending in a screaming match and Howard storming away. Lucy, incensed with rage, sent her cousin, one Charles Beresfield, after him. Beresfield, armed and with murderous intent, caught up with Howard and stabbed him through the arm. This did not prove fatal, and Howard, once recovered, began legal proceedings against Lucy, claiming she had stolen important papers from him and was using them to blackmail him. This was the last straw for Charles and the exiled Stuart court. They needed direct and decisive action. Charles wanted James away from his mother for good. Charles decided to use Colonel Arthur Slingsby to entrap Lucy by asking her to lodge with him as a guest. As a woman who was rapidly running out of friends, money and support, this must have seemed like a godsend. Slingsby waited a few weeks and then turned on Lucy. He raged that she had not paid her rent and that he was putting her in jail. Just like the original kidnapping attempt, she showed her true mettle and screamed the house down, ran into the streets and hollered about the abuse she was suffering. One thing we can always say of Lucy is that all throughout her life, she always somehow found a man she could turn to, whether it turned out for the best or not. The next man was a neighbour, Don Alonso de Cardenas, previously the Spanish ambassador to England, and he offered Lucy to stay somewhere else in safety. We must keep in mind that whilst Lucy was moving from house to house, from chaos to tragedy, her young boy James was always at her side, watching her struggle. A struggle to keep him safe. It was a vision of motherhood he would hold dearly, perhaps too dearly for the rest of his life. But for now, Lucy and James were sheltered and safe. Cardenas not only sheltered Lucy and James, but wrote to Charles and accused him of barbarous, abominable, and most unnatural treatment of a lady. But Cardenas, like Slingsby, was to prove false. Charles, through several letters, managed to recruit the Spaniard into his plan to split his son from Lucy. Cardenas attempted to convince Lucy to hand James over to his father. Lucy would not, but was happy to bring James up according to his father's wishes, but would not, as before, give up her son. Charles, though, had had enough, and at the very end of 1657 she was placed under house arrest by the Spanish on Charles's order. Even now she was still fighting for her future and for her son. She threatened to publish private letters that had passed between Lucy and Charles if his promises of a pension were not met. With scandal, embarrassment, and the unending headache Lucy was causing, Charles again tried to end this situation. This time, for Charles, it would prove successful. In the spring of the next year, Charles ordered one Thomas Ross to act. Ross had been a footman of King Charles I, and was now a groom at the bedchamber. He visited Lucy pretending he was there on official business. It may seem too easy considering all the other attempts and failures. Ross simply waited for Lucy to turn her back looking for some papers. Then he pounced. He grabbed the young boy and ran from the house. Unlike the initial kidnap, Lucy was unable to find her beloved son, as Ross kept him and the boy moving from safe house to safe house. For 6 months, James was kept out of public sight, until finally, and with a heavy heart, Lucy began to weaken. After years of stress and the constant fight to keep herself and her son safe and sheltered, her body began to crumble. Her illness, which her enemies claimed to be venereal disease, was weakening her, but not enough to stop her fighting. She managed to travel to Paris in October 1658, after hearing rumours that her son had been moved there. As her hunt continued, Lucy met the Protestant chaplain at Henrietta Maria's court, one John Cousin. Lucy used her acquaintance with Cousin and asked him to take her last confession, as she knew her days were numbered. This confession, unknown to the two, would be used in years to come by supporters of Lucy's son to prove his legitimacy. In the 1670s and 80s, Cousin would claim that Lucy had revealed that she and Charles had married, and that James, the future Duke of Monmouth, was the rightful heir to the throne of Britain. During or after the confession, there is a myth that Lucy handed over an infamous black box. In this box, it was suggested, was the marriage certificate which would prove Lucy's words and Monmouth's legitimacy. The whole of Monmouth's life, and the final tragedy of it, revolves around this legend. He would spend his life believing and arguing vehemently that his father and mother were married. Indeed, a rebellion would be started because of it, and thousands of men would die believing Monmouth was the rightful king. For our full video on the mystery of the black box and whether Monmouth was the rightful king, click here or follow the link in the description box below. It may seem a bit far-fetched, but future nobles and monarchs were deeply troubled by this legend. But for Lucy, it was too little, too late. With no son, no money coming in, her enemies all about, and disease attacking her, she finally succumbed. In the first week of December 1658, she passed away. Now it would be all too easy to jump straight into the next chapter of James's life. His adventures, his marriage, his soldiering, and his glamorous court life. But we should take a moment and acknowledge Lucy Walter and the courage she displayed in the face of such hostility. Lucy has been written into history as an unhinged nuisance who did nothing but stir up mischief for Charles and her son. She was embroiled in scandal and seemed to bounce from man to man without any shame or compunction. But forced into exile, abandoned while pregnant, with little support, she could have simply given up. On top of this, her son was kidnapped and constantly being tricked and promised protection and money by a line of unscrupulous rogues and knaves. Taking what support she could, she was labelled a whore, whilst facing the large army of support enjoyed by Charles and his exiled royal court. Of course she was not perfect, and she made poor decisions, but she faced hostility, imprisonment, and the kidnapping of her son, and yet she resisted all attempts to break her, and for that alone we should admire her. In our next episode, we see the young James move to England to be at the side of his father, the newly crowned merry monarch, King Charles II. Here, this innocent boy will quickly learn the ways, scandals, and the vices of the new court. He'll grow in confidence, gain popularity, be given honours and offices, and get married. But that will all have to wait until the next episode. Thanks for watching.